Welcome to the Black Writer Studio, a podcast presented by the Hurston Wright Foundation and hosted by Dr. Khadijah Ali-Coleman. The Black Writer Studio is dedicated to showcasing Black writers who are transforming the world today with their literary pen and creating a legacy for the culture. Amina Gautier is the author of 3 short story collections, At Risk, Now We Will Be Happy, and The Loss of All Lost Things. More than 130 of her stories have been published, appearing in over 17 publications, including the Latino Book Review, Los Angeles Review, Mississippi Review, and Quarterly West. She is the recipient of the Eric Hoffer Legacy Fiction Award, the Phillis Wheatley Book Award in Fiction, and the International Latino Book Award. For her body of work, she has received the Blackwell Prize, the Chicago Public Library Foundation's 21st Century Award, the Letras Boricuas Fellowship, and the PEN MALAMUD Award for Excellence in the Short Story. Welcome today, Dr. Amina Gautier, to the Black Writers Studio. And I have to say, one of the things that really struck me when preparing for your interview today was just how prolific a writer you are. And I'm personally very excited to be talking with someone who engages in writing short fiction, short stories. And you have over 130 of your short stories published nationally, internationally. And so my first question to you is really, while everyone and their mom is trying to write a novel, what really led you to invest your writing journey in writing short fiction?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm actually at 138 stories now.
That's right.
Who knows where we'll be next week?
That's right.
I love short stories. I guess you could say I'm addicted to the idea of the feeling of an epiphany. But for the record, I do want to say I did start out trying to be like everybody and their mama. Drafting some novels, which I realized weren't really novels. They were just extended like summaries, just like 100 long page, summaries that really were not novels. But I also just began to feel that there was a formula, especially that people were giving to Black writers, right? Which was do a short story collection and then a novel, or focus on a novel. And I said, well, if you follow the formula, then you're going to end up being like everyone else.
Right.
I don't want to be like everyone else. So I just wanted to just figure out what was right for me. And my personality matches the short story form. I also personally feel right now at this moment that it's really hard for long form fiction to sort of keep up with the current pace of the world. Are trying to write about current events. By the time the novel is finished, revised, drafted, polished, and brought into the world, that event is over. And it's 4 or 5 years behind that. But short stories, in my experience, can still capture the current moment. They can live in it. They can jump in it and respond almost immediately. Perhaps not as immediately as poetry, but short stories are able to get in the world fast enough to actually be part of the conversation about like how things are changing. So that's another reason why I stayed with them. But I started with them because you get to the moment where the character or the reader has that moment of enlightenment, that epiphany, and I just really feel a sense of accomplishment, and it feels good. So you want to keep doing it.
Right. Some would say that it even takes a special skill to write in a way where an entire story, an entire narrative has been shared in a shorter time frame. Have you found that there have been any particular muscles that you've stretched or had to stretch to be able to write in a concise, such a concise format, and being, while still being able to tell a full and robust story?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I've lived in a lot of places, but I'm a native New Yorker. I'm a Brooklynite, born and raised, which is to say that I'm super impatient. I just everything fast. I'm like, get to the point. So family members are telling you a story. Oh, back in the day, and you're like, what's the point? Like, can we get to the point? And so, like, short stories force you to jump into the middle of the action and to just get to the point. To just all of the jibber jabber and what happened was and way back when, and just focus on like what's immediately important. And the skill, one of the skills it produces is that it helps you to condense and compress, to figure out how much is essential and necessary to the story and how much is just sort of like excess baggage, or the writer just sort of like feeling themselves and just doing these grand pirouettes, right, and flourishing. So that's definitely a muscle that the short story form helps you develop with the craft, but also in real life. So when you start to talk to people, their eyes don't start drifting closed while you're telling your story, because you're like, this is the beginning, this is the middle, this is the end, boom, done.
Have you or do you look to any foremothers or forefathers of fiction, short fiction, that kind of model the way that you write? I know probably J. California Cooper is probably the mom of all. We're really familiar with her short stories. I know I grew up not really knowing that was even a possibility until I came across her work. Like, oh my goodness, someone has a collection of short stories. Because everything you're saying resonates with me. I love short fiction. I love short plays. But who were some of the folks that you looked to, before you engaged in this genre of writing?
Okay, too many to count, but like I said, so for writers that pretty much let me know from the beginning that I could just write about my hometown and just write about Brooklyn. The short stories in James Baldwin's Going to Meet the Man, most of them set in Harlem. Tony K. Bombard's collection, My Love, most of them set on the Upper West Side. And Paul Marshall's novel, Brown Girls, Brownstone, set in the Bed-Stuy that my grandmother and my mother grew up in. So like all of the, like I would read that novel and, she'd be talking about the Fulton Street trolley, which was gone. Yes. I came around, but my mom and my grandmother took it and like, oh yeah, it would go down this street. So I'm like, okay, Brooklyn is, it can be this world. I don't have to write about, the Upper East Side or Los Angeles or something like that. So those were the four parents for considerations of location and place. And then for thinking about like lyricism in writing, I'm a big fan of Jhumpa Lahiri, and Stuart Dybek has a short story called Pet Milk that I love. Michael Cunningham has a story called White Angel that I love. And then there are some really lovely sentences in Faulkner's stories, especially Barn Burning. I don't do the novel so much, but his individual stories, I really love short fiction writers who include poetic elements in their. I think that's something that I learned from Percival. I am a big fan of Percival Everett. My writing is absolutely nothing like his. I don't really have a satirical bone in my body, but the that he brings to every story, the rhetorical, philosophical, intellectual moves that he makes, those are inspirational as well. Also a fan of Carolyn Farrell's short stories. I'll stop there, but of course I could list like 100 more.
But it's what I think that what you're illustrating is that, and for someone to have, what did you say, 138 short stories placed, right? Okay. I think you just being able to rattle off all of these people that you've read and that you look to shows how well read you are, and how many writers, most really good writers like yourself, are really big readers, and not only readers, but paying attention to craft, the choices that writers make, so that then you can build your toolkit. One of the things that you said earlier, which really resonated with me, and I didn't interrupt while you were speaking because I was so absorbed with how you've given attention to the fact that short fiction has a place in being relevant to the times. And so I ask, does that mean that you make a particular point to connect what you're writing about to certain issues or movements or things that are happening politically, socially, in the world? Or is it important to at least have that as a backdrop? Can you speak a little bit as to why that is important to make that relevant, and why short fiction is more relevant, and why you choose that as a genre?
Well, I didn't set out to respond to the times, but since 2016, I found myself being unable to avoid that. I would be working on a longer project, a short story collection project, and the escalation of racial violence against people of color, primarily against African American, Black, African, and Caribbean people, but also against Asian Americans, just really sort of just bogarted my project. It was like, you can't look around and see all this and not say something. So I wrote a series of shorts, which I guess in my mind, they're under this heading Breathe, that were responding to all of the beautiful young Black lives that we've lost unnecessarily, needlessly, to prejudice, race violence, ignorance, police brutality in the last 5 or 6 years. And that just felt so much more pressing than a project that I'm working on, but that's set in the 80s and 90s, because I can always go back to that. But this was like a moment that I couldn't let escape me and pass by without being a part of it. A writer a long time ago said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And of course, as a fiction writer, I expand that to include fiction writers. But one of the things that artists do is that we have the power to record and document cultural responses to political and social events in ways that scholars and historians would not be able to capture, so that someone 10, 15, 20 years from now, looking back at it, can look at the history, but also look at what the artists were producing to get a fuller, more realistic picture of what the context actually was. So I think it's important, if your art makes you feel so inclined, to dip your toes in that water. I'm not sure if there was another part to your question.
No. That was very a full response, and what it speaks to is that it sounds like your writing is your opportunity to it's to express, it's not just about the artfulness of expression, but also being part of the fabric of this history. When you're even saying that the responsibility of an artist is to speak to the times, and everyone has heard Nina Simone's words on that. But what you're saying is that it should be the priority. And do you look at your role as a Black woman who's a writer? Is that a burden, or has that in any way stopped you from being able to engage in other forms of expression or other topics that you want to include because of these things that are impacting our community politically and socially?
Not at all. It has not been a burden. I assume it won't become one, knock on wood. It's been nothing but a privilege. If I weren't a writer, I can't imagine what else I'd be doing. Whatever else I'd be doing, I'd be doing it really poorly at it. And gosh, I mean, I guess I would probably still write if I weren't a Black. but it's such I don't even know how to separate those things, because there is this position that that we have in terms of race and gender, of having a sort of privileged position and being able to comment on feminism and where feminism leaves us behind and drops us, and to be able to comment on sexism, right? Like, we have this very specific niche position, allows us to sort of pivot and be a part of a lot of conversations. So I would say that for me, it's been a privilege to be a writer, but I do understand what you're saying. Like, do the current moments sort of, take away from other things that I could be writing? Well, one of the great things about writing so many short stories, I've gotten to the point where, I trust myself, and, I've got like 25 ideas like in my notebook in the queue, just waiting for me to have time to write them. So there are, things that I want to write about that are not necessarily dependent upon time. And so I just trust myself that I can get back to those things once I've finished saying whatever I have to say about the current moment. But I make sure that I don't just trust my memory. Like, I jot them down, I make notes, I start drafts. I have tons of unfinished Word documents of projects that I intend to get back to, that are maybe not race focused or maybe not time specific, but right now I'm just focusing on these.
One of the things that folks tend to ask me, because I do a lot of things, is how do you find all the time? And I tell people that in order to do a lot of things, I have a system. I have an organization system that works for me, but it's necessary for me to be able to do all the things that I want to do. For someone who has written or has placed, because I know if you've placed 138 pieces, that you've written way more than that. For those who are listening and the term writer's block comes into their consciousness, or just have no idea how to just push out so much, do you have any words or advice or anything about your practice that you want to share that you really rely on to be able to continue to create and to produce work and share it with other people?
Yes. Well, first, this is going to make people hate me, but I do have to say I have not yet ever had writer's block. So, but now I'm going to tell people about my practice, and maybe they can see why I haven't had it, or maybe I'm just fooling myself and I'm calling it something else.
Yes, tell us the secret.
So one, I'm super impressed that you have organizational skills, because I am the least organized person in the world. Like, one of the reasons I'm a writer is because I don't like to wake up early and I don't like people telling me what to do. So, like, there's never been a time in my life where I'm like, I'm getting up at 7 a.m. and I'm going to the cafe and I'm going to write for 2 hours and write every day. Like, that's never happened. But I make up for it by writing multiple things at the same time. Like, I have like I said, I'm super impatient. I have a very short attention span. And when I'm working on something, if it gets boring, I just save it, I put it in a draft, and I just leave it on the computer and I go to something else. I'm also a big hand writer. I'm Gen X, I'm 45, so I started with spiral notebooks.
Yep.
So I still use them, and especially when I'm traveling so much and you're in like confined spaces, like the little Amtrak seat with the teeny little table that folds down, the airplane, right? Again, with the little table, that's when I'll just pull out my notebook and I'll just free write for the whole trip. I'll write down, take public transportation also, so I can keep my mind free and I can observe my surroundings. I'll write down bits of dialogue, imagery, etc. But in my mind, I'll be sorting it out, like, oh, this is for this story, this is for this story. And I'll have 10 to 20 stories running at any given time, because psychologically, I would probably have writer's block if I had to face a blank page writing. Like that's something that I cannot do. So writing by hand gives me space to open up a Word document and then transcribe what I've written into the document. And even if it's messy, it's not a blank page. So I'll write and I'll advance multiple documents. And then, one day I'm like grumpy or antsy and like, I really need to finish something. And I just keep starting all these things. And I'll open different documents and work in them until I find one that is compelling me, that day. For me, the document needs to have at least 3,000 words in it for me to trick myself. And once, and again, these are not pretty documents. Like things are not spell checked. There's no punctuation, no capitalization. Like if you would look at it, you'd be like, this person is not a writer, right? It's not pretty. But once I see like, oh, there's 3,000 words in there, then I think to myself, well, okay, this is already a story. And all I need to do is just kind of move the paragraphs around and figure out the beginning, middle, and the end. And of course, you always need to do that, but that's what gets me like pulled in without like being overly critical. And then I can this revision process and that, and I might stay with that document for, 5-6 days, 2-3 weeks, a month or two, until a full draft is ready for me to set it aside, and then I'll rest it for anywhere up to 6 months before I look at it again.
Oh, wow. Do you typically, how does that change any if you have, if someone is waiting, like if a publisher or if an anthology collection that you're going to be a part of, if they're waiting for the piece, does any part of that process change? Because letting it breathe for 6 months, sometimes it depends on, if you have a deadline, do you typically create freely and then submit for, to a publisher or to a project? Or have you ever written where someone's like, I want some things that are along this theme or what have you, and then you write to request?
Yeah, so not yet. I've had 1 or 2 solicitations where they just asked me to, like Studio Magazine in Harlem asked me to submit a piece that was inspired by artwork, but I had about 6 months to think about it. And I also am a big fan of Romare Bearden, and I had, some Romare Bearden things hanging around in my head. So I was able to work that out in 6 months, but I had to write like 3 other stories first before I could do that. So I didn't feel like somebody was telling me what to do. Yeah, like really strong, stubborn streak. But to really answer your question, this is another piece of advice that really informs my practice. I got this piece of advice like over 20 years ago, back in 1999, when I was a first year PhD student. And there was a writer who was letting me audit his class, and we built up a friendship. And I somehow convinced him with like coffee and chicken fingers to like read a story of mine like each week, right? Like I'd show up and I'd give him a story. And he read like maybe 15 stories over the course of a semester. And they all sucked until the last one. And I finally wrote one, which, he thought was like, okay, this one is polished enough. You could send it out. That story was Palabras, which is in my second collection, Now You Will Be Happy. And then he's like, so this one is ready to go. And then he said, but now you need to write 10 more like that. And, to the listener, it kind of sounds like maybe he's telling me write 10 of the same story. But what he was doing was introducing me to the portfolio method or concept, which a lot of artists who are not writers use. Like if you think about an actual visual artist, they don't just take one photograph. Like they have a portfolio of pictures in natural light, artificial light, etc. before they go out. So what he was saying was, develop 10 stories that are of publishable, polished quality before you submit your first story. And then within those 10 stories, develop a range. So in those 10 stories, I had stories that were first person, second person, third person, first person plural, short, flash fiction pieces, 500 words, flash fiction pieces, 1,000 words, traditional length stories, 3,000 to 6,000 words, stories with no flashbacks whatsoever, stories that were reverse chronology, stories with male protagonists, stories with female protagonists, stories from the point of view of children and adolescents, and stories from the point of view of adults, to just really kind of like, build up my chops before I sent one out. And so I normally don't write to spec or on demand, but usually when people ask me for something, I'm like Prince, I have like a vault. Usually, right now I'm down to like 6, but I normally try to keep like 10 stories that are ready to go. Psychologically, for the people listening, one of the things that does, if it sounds difficult, is that it helps you create a separation between your craft and the publishing industry's response, right? If you've written one really good story and you keep sending it out and you're focusing on that, if that story gets accepted, you might end up limiting yourself artistically, because now you want the positive feedback that came from that acceptance. And maybe you just end up writing stories that keep replicating the first one. But if you create the portfolio first of all, if that story gets rejected, it's not you. I've got 10 stories that are published and polished and ready to go. If this journal doesn't want this, that's not a reflection on my talent. That's a reflection on that journal's taste. And hey, I'll just send them story number 2. They don't want story 2, I'll just send them story number 3, right? You don't end up having that moment where you're thinking like, I'm never gonna make it. I'm no good. I need to go, eat ice cream for the next 2 hours and make myself feel better. Like the portfolio helps build your confidence and your security and brings the focus back on your craft and your talent, regardless of what the publishing industry's response to it might be.
What excellent advice. That's so important, because, and it sounds like you yourself have really focused on making sure that you retain your writer's voice, and that it's not victim to the ego or to just the mores of the publishing world, that you really want to retain what it is about yourself as an artist that you value, the ability to write and have the flexibility to write to what's going on, the ability to have this range. And I love how you shared in creating your portfolio, that you built your chops by playing with different perspectives, lengths, and structures and forms. And so I just find such value in all the things that you've shared. So I do want you to have the opportunity now to share with us what are some places where folks can read more of your work, things that you have coming up that you want folks to check for, and what are those digital spaces that you want folks to follow to keep up with your writing journey?
Well, outside of the 3 collections, At Risk, Now We Will Be Happy, and The Loss of All Lost Things, which I think is maybe just comprises about 30 of my stories. The other 100 or so are just published in individual journals, and more recently, quite a few of them have been online, so people can check Oxford American, the Los Angeles Review, American Short Fiction, Latino Book Review. A lot of my short pieces, the flash fiction pieces, can typically be found in online journals. I do have a webpage. I don't know the name of it. My own webpage address. I do have a personal author page on Facebook, and I do have a regular author webpage whose web addresses I do not know by.
I think it is safe at this point for you can say to folks, Google me, and they will come upon your spaces. But I'm chuckling to myself when you said that your book, it just has 30 of your pieces. Yeah. Just 30 pieces. But can you tell us the name of that again, and where are some of the spaces where folks can buy that book?
So the first book is At Risk, and that is all about at-risk children during the war on drugs, half of the kids who make it and half of the kids who don't. The second collection is Now We Will Be Happy, which is about Afro-Latinos, also set in the 80s and 90s during the war on drugs. Both of these collections are set in New York. Collection is The Loss of All Lost Things, which is not set in Brooklyn or in the 80s. Different and various forms of loss. So those books can be found in your traditional bookstores, in the publishers' web pages. So University of Georgia Press, University of Nebraska Press, and Elixir Press. They can also be found on small SPD, small press distribution. I don't know if I'm allowed to say the A word, but obviously those books can be found at that online place.
Right.
Not suggesting people go there.
Right, but I like the fact that you're also mentioning to go directly to the source and support small booksellers as well. So thank you so much for sharing. I think that you, just in such a short amount of time, that you've given aspiring writers so much hope, I think, with breaking down your process, but also showing that, there is another outlet for us to write, that it doesn't always have to be a poem. It doesn't always have to be a novel, doesn't have to be a play or a screenplay, but short fiction has the ability to really speak and to reflect the things that are happening around us, and that there's so many muscles that we can stretch when writing short fiction. So thank you so much for being a guest today on the Black Writers Studio. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Thank you for having me, Khadijah.
Oh, thank you so much.